Okay, can you confirm that Zoom can hear? Thank you very much. Okay. It takes a team, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the September meeting of the San Antonio chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas. We want to start off first by welcoming any new members. Do we have any in the audience here? Oh, wow. We have about 4 or 5. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you to all returning members, of course, as well. Do we have any new visitors in the room? Oh, wow. We've got a lot of new visitors too. Welcome. And also our Zoom audience, of course. We really appreciate everybody joining us tonight. And the photo here is of our pollinator plant of the year, clammy weed. And I mentioned this at our last meeting, which was 2 months ago. If you had gotten some seed earlier this year and put it out, you might have some of these blooming right now. Some of them might still be waiting, but here's some that were blooming. And I've been seeing a lot of swallowtails hanging out on the clammy weed lately. I will be mentioning an event that's coming up where we'll be handing out more seeds in case you haven't gotten any or you need more. So we do have an announcement from the state, and I know there's a lot of words on here, but what we've done is the state organization has partnered with the Homegrown National Park, and we're promoting native plants together. And what we would like you to do, what the state is asking everybody to do, is to learn about Texas native plants, acquire at least one or more new Texas native plants for your yard, and then plant your new native plant in time to celebrate Texas Native Plant Week, which is coming up the 3rd week of October. And also, if you're not already on the Homegrown National Park map, consider putting your space onto that map. Let's see, where's Pam? Did I get everything, Pam? Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's time. We've got a few changes to our board. It's that time of year. And so we want to say a big thank you to the outgoing board members. And we have Haley Giambalvo is leaving us as vice president. Thank you so much, Haley, for all that you've done. She's not totally leaving. She's taken a position at the state level as chair of the communications committee. Is that right? Awesome. She's done a great job. And we really appreciate all she's done. And she does a lot of stuff behind the scenes. And then our members at large, and that is Alicia Ramsey and Diane Gracia, but Diane is not going far. She's right there. Thank you. She's not going far. This is our new incoming board for 2025. Diane is going to serve as our vice president. So thank you, Diane. And then we have 2 new members at large. We have Juan Loyola, and he has been doing a great job on our newsletter. I don't think he's here tonight, but he's also been taking a lot of awesome videos for us. And then Shannon Jackson, and is Shannon here? Where is Shannon? Oh, there she is. Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us. And then I'll be staying. Claire Carter is remaining as secretary, and Talat is staying as treasurer. So there you have it. And we just had, I say we loosely because I wasn't able to attend, and everybody else put this all together, a successful fall garden tour for our members. This was a members only tour, and it happened on September 22nd. And Haley Giambalvo put this all together. We've been talking about having a garden tour for a while, and we just didn't have anyone that was able to take it on, and she took it on recently and made it happen. So thank you, Haley. She also offered up her garden as one of the 4 gardens. So the member gardens that were on the tour included Haley's, Jay Collins, and he was here somewhere. There he is right there. And Pam Peck, and she's in the back, and Shannon Jackson. So thank you, everybody, for showing off your beautiful gardens. And we also want to thank the volunteers that supported it. So we have RC Silex, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Claire Carter, Joan Miller, and Juan Loyola again. I'm sorry, Juan, I'm not able to say your last name. And he took some videos, and are those going to be going on our YouTube? You know? Okay. With information onto the gardens, kind of the background on how they came to be and the plant list. So we'll be providing that to everybody as well. So for the Zoom audience that maybe didn't hear that, the video will be going on the YouTube channel, and we have a PDF with images of the different gardens that we'll also be making available to folks. So and congratulations to the 30 members who secured a spot on this. They, from what I understand, they went really, really fast. 2 hours they were gone within 2 hours of the notice. So we do have plans to offer future garden tours again. So keep your eyes open for that. We are still looking for just a few more volunteers for the upcoming Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival on October 5th. That's a Saturday. It's going to be at Breckenridge Park. It's a really, really awesome event. If you aren't going to volunteer, it's a great one to go to. We've got 2 shifts. The first one is from 9 to 11, and the second one is from 11 to 1:30. And so if you are interested, I forgot to put the volunteer email at the bottom of this slide, but it is
NPSOT SA volunteers @gmail.com.
NPSOT SA volunteers with an S at gmail.com. And we do have some volunteers that are helping to support an upcoming event, a first of its kind for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. It's called Rooted in Texas. This is happening on the same day as the Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival. So you can volunteer a shift and go over to the Edwards Aquifer Authority, drive through plant pickup, or you can just go to the drive-through plant pickup if you want. And that's October 5th, starting at 9 a.m. And they're giving out, I believe, a lot of native plants. They're going to have 3 different stations that you'll just drive up to. At one of them, you will get a native shade plant. At the next one, you'll get a native sun plant. And at the third one, you'll get a goodie bag. So it sounds really fun. It's the first time they've done it. They're very excited about it. So put that on your calendars. And oh, I should say it's at their headquarters, which is downtown, not too far from where the Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival is happening at Breckenridge Park. So this is at 900 East Quincy, and they've got information on their website. So this Saturday, the 28th, we've got a really awesome nature walk here at Harberger Park with Cleveland Powell. And it's going to be starting at 8. They are asking you to come a little bit early, just so they have everybody. They'll go over in the classroom some basics of grasses. This is a really amazing opportunity to learn about grasses with one of the top experts that we have in the area, Cleve. And again, that's this Saturday, starting at 8. You will be walking around after the classroom part to see some of the grasses out in the wild. And let's see, where's John? Here's John. John's going to come up and talk about our Meetup group that has 866 members.
Watch your step.
Okay. Okay, yes. Meetup is a global online thing where people are linked together through shared interests. So if you're, and they have every possible thing. If you're a left-handed square dancer who's into stamp collecting, they've got a Meetup group for you, I'm sure. Okay, ours was started back in the Lions Field era. We used to meet there. Jerry Morrissey set it up. Here's how you find it. You go to meetup.com. You don't need to log in or anything. Just go to meetup.com, and then there's a search for San Antonio.
Native plants.
San Antonio native plants. That's all you need. It's called San Antonio Native Plants Events, but just that'll hit you to it. As Lee said, we have 866. When I get home tonight, I hope we have 1,000. Okay. Anybody here that's here because they saw the Meetup announcement? See, it works. Great. Okay. We have, there's about 6 of us who are agents on it. Peter, myself, Joan, Jerry, Stan Dresik, and there are events already on there through next August set up. So, and if you hear of an event or if you're starting an activity, let one of us know and we'll put it on Meetup, okay? And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And sometimes there's some unique opportunities that pop up on there. So like walks in the wild with Jerry Morrissey and whatnot. So it's a good place to join. Okay, our next chapter meeting is October 22nd, and it is titled Restoration Endeavors Using Native Plants. And we've got 3 speakers from the Northside Independent School District. You know, we've got David Oberg here, and Isaac Esquivel and Amalia Solers. And that should be a great presentation. So get that on your calendars. And the moment we've all been waiting for. I'm very happy to have Monika Maeckle here tonight. She is a friend of mine. She is here to talk with us about her new book, The Monarch Butterfly Migration, Its Rise and Fall. And I've been fortunate to see these monarchs along the Llano River that she describes in her book. It's an amazing sight. I know she's been working on this for a while and is very happy that it's out, and we're very happy to have her here. So while I switch over, we do have.
Well, I want to really thank everyone for coming out. This is my first like presentation of my book. I did a book event, but it was just like talking with someone. So you guys are a little bit of a guinea pig audience, so I'm very open to suggestions. So please provide feedback. Anyway, we're going to talk about my book, but I wanted to just start out because people always ask me how I came. One of the questions that comes up is, how did you come to write this book? And Lee mentioned that the book was in process for a long time, 7 years. I started this book in 2017, and I was asked today on the Big City Small Town podcast. And I would like to recognize my husband, Robert Rivard, who we're calling Bob Maeckle, as he accompanies me on my book events. His first Native Plant Society meeting, and our dog Cacti, who is my favorite tagging partner. And when I go tag monarch butterflies at the ranch. So, but yes, it took a long time to get this book written, mostly because I couldn't get anybody to publish it. And I was at the point where I was like, look, if I can get this book published, I'm just going to self-publish. And I was so glad when the editor at University of Oklahoma Press reached out to me and said, hey man, I really like what you're doing with your book. What you want to talk about? I was like, yeah, let's go. So anyway, I'm going to just read this. It's like a 2-minute preface that sort of sets the stage for how this all came about. Butterflies have captivated humans for time immemorial, but when National Geographic announced the discovery, in quotation marks, of the monarch butterfly overwintering sites in the Mexican mountains on its August 1976 cover, a particular orange and black butterfly was thrust into the spotlight. In the ensuing decades, monarch butterflies captured the imagination of the world, especially those of us who live along their migratory flyway, which spans a tri-national corridor touching Canada, the United States, and Mexico. How and why have we become so captivated by this insect? In some ways, the answer is obvious. They're beautiful and accessible, they don't sting or bite, and they set examples of extreme resilience and transformation. Yet, despite our deep and genuine appreciation for butterflies and monarchs in particular, we can't seem to agree on how best to support them. Why? And when scientific studies conflict with firsthand experience and conservation advocacy, how do each of us decide what the right thing to do is? These questions have driven me for 2 decades and prompted an exploration for answers through a website I launched called Texas Butterfly Ranch. It began as a personal blog in 2010 and a tool for learning about new media, my profession at the time, and butterflies, a newfound passion. That simple act brought about a midlife metamorphosis that turned me into a full-time pollinator advocate. The journey has taken me from the northern tip of the Great Lakes to the remote mountains of the Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt and many points in between. I've stopped in at Monsanto in St. Louis for a tour, spent time at Monarch Watch in Kansas, visited the roosting sites in Mexico and California multiple times, and interviewed hundreds of professional and citizen scientists, policymakers, and butterfly enthusiasts. I've also spent the better part of 3 decades in a part of the world where monarchs split along our San Antonio River much of the year and form impressive overnight roosts in the Texas Hill Country in the fall. And as founder of San Antonio's Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival, I've had the privilege of hosting some of the top monarch scientists in person in my hometown. Not long after I started on this curiosity tour, queries asking, "Where's the Texas Butterfly Ranch?" began to pour into my online mailboxes, most often when monarch butterflies are on the move in spring and fall. People were intrigued by my chronicles of caterpillar wrangling and kayak tagging along the Lena River, the discovery of the monarch roosting sites, and the conflicting guidance they found online regarding raising monarchs, in particular milkweeds. They wanted to come visit the Texas Butterfly Ranch in person. "Is this a real place? I don't see an address," readers would message me. Physically, the Texas Butterfly Ranch encompasses the geographic area around Austin, San Antonio, and the Texas Hill Country, the famous Texas funnel through which all monarch butterflies east of the Rocky Mountains pass during their spectacular fall migration. It includes an amazing pollinator garden in downtown San Antonio, a place where I grow mostly native plants, occasionally collect eggs and caterpillars of monarchs and other butterflies, and cultivate host and nectar plants in my mariposario, a stacked rock butterfly house designed by our architect's son, Nicholas Rivard. It also encompasses a wildlife-riddled stretch of the Lena River in the Texas Hill Country. Metaphorically, I like to say the Texas Butterfly Ranch is a lens through which to view complex issues: migration, immigration, climate change, and sustainability. When my family acquired our ranch on the Lena River in 2000, it took 5 years for me to realize that native milkweeds populated the riverbanks. Later, when I realized the pecan trees on the bank opposite our house served as roosts for thousands of monarch butterflies each fall, that was it. I was hooked. What's most striking in hindsight, they'd always been there. I just hadn't noticed. My hope is that this book will nudge readers into noticing too. So that's how all of this started. And for me, and I'll read another brief chapter later that kind of describes my first encounter. Let's see. Most people were introduced, or many people were introduced to monarch butterflies in the migration when this National Geographic landed on their coffee table in 1976. And I don't know about you, but everybody in my world when I was growing up in the 70s subscribed to National Geographic. And I honestly do not recall this one, but I have gone and sought it out at various places, at antique shops and collectors bookstores and things. And I have 3 copies at home that I have in a Ziploc bag that I cherish. But crazily, this woman, Catalina Trail, is the only living survivor who was physically present when the monarch butterfly roosting sites were discovered in 1976. And for many people, this magazine is what captivated people and like first introduced them to monarchs. And is one of the reasons I think that we've been on this journey of being charismatically in love with this butterfly ever since. So just to kind of go over the whole drill here, Catalina and her crew discovered the roosting sites in 1975 in the mountains of Michoacan, which you can see on the map here. But just so everybody knows, I don't know how much everyone knows about the migration. I've been told I need to explain this quickly. Typically monarch butterflies, they're going to be passing through San Antonio here shortly. We've had kind of a really late migration with the hot weather we've had. And all of those butterflies that pass through here are heading down to Michoacan in the state of Mexico to a very small patch of forest at 10,000 feet. And for some reason, all of these butterflies go to the same place. It's a really crazy, mysterious phenomenon. We still don't know why they go there and how they find their way, because the butterflies that go there have never been there before. What they're going to do is they're going to fly down to Mexico. They're going to spend the winter there. And so obviously one of the most important things we can do to provide for them here in San Antonio is nectar plants, because they need to nectar up and build up their lipids and their fats to get them through the winter, because they're going to endure this winter, and there's snowstorms, there's sleet, there's all kinds of crazy stuff. It also gets hot, but we want them to get through till March, because in March, they're going to wake up from their diapause, which is their reproductive, they cease their reproductive activities for the winter, but they're still, they're not completely asleep. They get up and go get water or whatever, but they wait until March, and then they have this big butterfly orgy, and they mate with as many partners as possible. And there's some crazy, weird stuff about that. Female monarch butterflies can have multiple partners. And anyway, there's a whole chapter on that, which is fascinating. they reproduce, the males typically die, and the females start heading north. And so those females head north, and very, very often, the very first place they stop to lay their eggs is right here in Texas. And they only will lay their eggs on milkweed plants, which is a particular kind of Asclepias species. And we have, you know, we can talk more about that later, but there's all different kinds. I think there's 120 species or so of milkweed plants. And they lay their eggs, then they die, and then that generation starts the first generation of monarch butterflies, typically here in Texas. So many scientists have said Texas is the most important state in the monarch butterfly migration. So when they lay their eggs here in the spring, then they go through the drill. It's about a month-long cycle, and then they fly north, and they just keep following the milkweed north, further, 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 all the way up to Canada. And by the time they get to Canada, it's typically the third or fourth generation of monarch butterflies, and they just keep moving. And then they get the cues from the sun. We just had the equinox, so we had 12 days of light and 12 days, and the days start to get shorter. When those days start to get shorter, they start moving south again. And you know, it used to be that it could get cold this time of year. That's not happening as much, but they are moving south. You know, we're getting lots of reports that the monarchs are moving south. It's a little bit late this year. They had a very, very hot summer up north. So anyway, just so you know, this is the cycle. So those butterflies that make it all the way to Mexico, they've never been there before. And so that was one of the things that was fascinating and intriguing and charismatic and fantastic about this creature. Like, how do they find their way? And it still fascinates people to this day. So this is Fred and Nora Urquhart in the 50s. And Fred Urquhart was a Canadian scientist who was the first one to tag monarch butterflies. And he and his wife, Nora, she was like a master's degree in science, and he was a PhD. They put together one of the earliest citizen science programs, which at the time they called research associates. And the way that they tried, and this was back in the days, you know, we didn't have Google Maps, we didn't have email, we didn't have iPhones. They did everything through the mail, which is shocking to consider when you think about it. They actually had an article in National Museum of Natural History magazine that, I think I actually have that here. Yes, Natural History magazine in March of 1952, page 226, where they advertised for research associates. And they wrote this article. Actually, Nora wrote the article. Fred got the byline because he was Dr. Urquhart, and they figured it would have more credibility. But they documented and proposed this seemingly barbarian way of tagging monarch butterflies, which you can see here. They literally took a hole puncher and punched a hole in the outer, you can see where they did it, on the outer wing of the butterfly. And then they got a piece of paper that they had marked with numbers saying return to the, contact the University of Toronto. And they took some glue, which happened to be toxic, and they put it on there, and they wrapped it around, and the glue would fasten through the hole. And they started this program of tagging monarch butterflies. And it was really pretty amazing that they could get any kind of traction with this, but they did it for decades. And they tagged thousands and thousands of monarch butterflies. And through this process, they were finally able to figure out that the butterflies went to Mexico. And so, I mean, when you think about it, today, we have stickers on everything from oranges to our windshield. The kind, to come up with this idea. I mean, bird banding was around probably by then already, but I mean, tagging a butterfly by punching a hole in its wing and putting glue on a piece of paper, I mean, that sounds pretty whack. So, meanwhile, there was another scientist, and guess what? There were two white male scientists that were very competitive with each other, and they didn't really want to cooperate with each other, and they really wanted to compete with each other for the credit it was going to take to identify where the monarch butterflies were roosting. And so this is all in the book. I mean, it's a very interesting scientific rivalry, and we see those continue to this day, where scientists are competing for the dominant narrative. But Lincoln Brower was probably 20 years younger than Urquhart, and he pioneered DNA fingerprinting, where he's been out to our ranch on the Lena River before he died. He came out during the drought of 2011, and he gathered 50 monarch butterflies and took them back to the lab and ground them up into a paste to examine the lipid content of how fat they were. And by doing that, he could also tell what kind of milkweed they ate. So he knew that if it was, common milkweed, they weren't from Texas, they were probably from further north. But in any case, when he saw the article in National Geographic magazine, he was so intrigued because he'd been studying butterflies for a while, and he went to Fred Urquhart and tried to convince him say, hey man, where was this? Because they were very obtuse in the article. They did not say where exactly the butterflies were. It's very vague. And it's understandable. They didn't want, a bunch of people to rush down there and ruin the forest. But he thought it was insulting that a fellow scientist would not cooperate and say, oh, well, here's the coordinates of where they were, because he was going to continue to research. So they had this kind of rivalry. There's a really famous story called The Unpleasant Incident in the Forest, where they actually met up with each other. And this is the moment where, after Fred Urquhart announced in National Geographic, Lincoln Brower recruited a fellow Texan, Bill Calvert. I don't know if any of you know him, but he was in Austin. And he knew from spelunking down in Mexico, he knew where he could get butterflies. And he kind of led this party, and they figured out exactly where the butterflies roosted. And they went down there and they actually ran into each other in the forest, which is kind of insane to think about. So the other thing I just wanted to mention that I skipped over was when Lincoln Brower was studying the DNA fingerprinting, one of the most famous experiments he did was this barfing blue jay experiment, where he literally somehow he figured out how to feed monarch butterflies pumpkin and cabbage and other things that were not milkweed, and he got them to eat it. And then he snuck them a monarch caterpillar, blue jays. I'm talking about blue jays. I'm sorry. Well, yeah, no, what he did was he fed the caterpillars cabbage, and he fed them to the blue jays, and then he snuck one in that was that had eaten milkweed, and milkweed contains all kinds of toxins, and it makes the blue jays retch. And so this famous photograph proved that monarch butterflies are what they eat, and the toxins that they consume and metabolize in their bodies, which is responsible for their bright coloration, makes them taste bad. And so that's one of the reasons that when you see monarch butterflies fly, they have this kind of dreamy flight pattern where they just kind of flit along, whereas you see other butterflies and they're like skittering all over, because the birds know, oh man, that's a really tasty one. But they know one time they eat a monarch butterfly, never again. And so it's just interesting. And I think, I can't remember the word for it, but there's a word for it in science where bright colors typically project, don't eat me, I'm toxic, it doesn't taste good. And this proved it. So this is my friend, Jenny Singleton, who's the person who first introduced me to monarch butterfly tagging in Menard, Texas in 2004. This is her daughter in 1993. In 1993, they were still tagging the butterflies with the hole puncher and the glue and the paper, which is really hard to believe. And Jenny was one of the first people. She was a kindergarten teacher, and she really wanted to incorporate this. She's just fascinated by it. And she's been doing it for decades, and she's now the chief docent of the Flutterby Festival in Grapevine, Texas, who really helped me out when I started the Monarch Butterfly Festival. I just called them up and they gave me all the, okay, here's what you need to do and who to call. So that was great. But anyway, how many of you have tagged a monarch butterfly? Has anyone here tagged a monarch? Okay, good. So you know the drill, but just for those who don't, but that picture of Katie was in 1993. Well, in 1994, Fred Urquhart shut down what he called the Research Associates of Migration Studies. And Dr. Chip Taylor of Monarch Watch at the University of Kansas was another much younger scientist, an entomologist. He'd been studying sulfur butterflies, and he developed a severe allergy to sulfur butterflies where he would get anaphylactic. So then he went to bees and he started studying bees, and he decided he studied killer bees as an expert on the bees that are very defensive. And then he got to a point where he was like, I don't want to do this because I'm going to have to get into molecular biology. I'm going to be out in the field. And so he took up the Monarch tagging program and started Monarch Watch. And that's a fascinating story as well about how, to come up with the glue and the sticker. And he worked with 3M Corporation. They developed this very specific glue. And I think about it, this butterfly tag, it has to go on that discal cell, which is in the middle of the center of gravity of the monarch butterfly. And it's been tested over and over. And a lot of people, doesn't it affect their flight? And supposedly it does not affect their flight. They've, recovered many, many thousands of butterflies in Michoacan on the forest floor. So they do make it to Mexico. But the quest to kind of figure out what is the perfect soup of glue, that can make a sticker stick to these are like scales on the butterfly's wing. It's not an even surface. There's like air between each scale. It's a very complex challenge. As Chip Taylor's, it's not a trivial undertaking in any way, was the way he describes developing the tags. But they figured out the certain glue that was going to work with 3M Corporation, and they started the tagging program in 1994, and they just celebrated their 30th anniversary recently. So how do you tag a butterfly? This is us at the ranch. You know, a lot of people raise butterflies at home. You can, go get a caterpillar or find an egg and have it on a milkweed plant and watch it go through the process. And if it's in the fall, we only tag butterflies in the fall because it doesn't make any sense to tag them because they're not going to go to one place. I mean, the reason we're able to recover these tags is they all go to this exact same place. So here's our place on the Atlanta River, and these pecan trees are the perfect roosting site because the butterflies are flying, they're drafting, they're flying hundreds of miles. And in the evening, they drop from the sky and they hang out in these pecan trees. And on the left, you can see there's a limestone escarpment. So when it's cooler, that limestone is holding the heat and generating back onto the butterfly. So it's like a perfect situation. And as I said, I mean, I was walking around this place for 5 years before I noticed this. And it was like unbelievable that I had not noticed that there were thousands of monarch butterflies. I mean, it is a timing thing. Like you can go, one year I went every single weekend in October because I want to make sure I caught them. You don't know exactly when they're going to be there, but I mean, it's in a very impressive sight. So you get the butterfly in the net, you apply the tag to the distal cell as I described her. That's cacti who's happened to be here. That always helps me out. That's exactly where you put it. And those are the tags in the background there. And then you record the tag number. Is it a male or female? The date, the time, the place. And then you submit all that data to Monarch Watch. And I like to carry around a little notebook and then I transfer it all over to a spreadsheet. But now they have an app. You can actually take a picture of the tag and upload it to Monarch Watch. They have Google spreadsheets that you can fill out. And I think I've tagged 10,000 with our festival. I've tagged over 10,000 butterflies, and I think I've had about 70 or 80 recoveries. So then you release it to the wind. I like to, sometimes you can give it a kiss and wish it a good journey. But as I mentioned earlier, or maybe I didn't, is when they get down there, the tags are worth $5 each. So the people in Mexico know that these butterflies with tags on them, it's worth $5. So like when you go down there to visit, you'll have somebody come up saying, hey, are you collecting stickers? And they have ambassadors. Monarch Watch has ambassadors. Like I've been down there and you just take some cash and you pay everybody $5 per tag, send the tags into Monarch Watch, and then they record all of that. And there's a huge database that you can go look up. Every year they announce, usually in February or March, the recoveries for that year. And like I said, I've had about 70 recovered, and it's pretty exciting when your butterflies recovered. I mean, it's pretty magical. So in 2020, we did our Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival at the Pearl for 4 years, and then we were going to have our big 5th anniversary party in 2020. And guess what happened? COVID. So we couldn't do anything in person. So we ended up doing a completely virtual festival, and it was great. We got to learn about this thing called Zoom, which we're all doing now. But the other thing that we did for the first time was, you all will remember, I'm sure, how there was no way to mourn death. I mean, people were dying. There were like refrigerator trucks and parking lots filled with, caskets, and it was just the most sad thing. So we started, one of the aspects of the monarch butterfly migration that we haven't really talked about, it's also just a super captivating thing, is that the butterflies, when they arrive, and they move through here, they're getting ready to start coming through, and they usually arrive by Day of the Dead, which is November 5th or 6th in Mexico. So just imagine you're an indigenous person, and every year around the same weekend, millions and millions and millions of these orange and black butterflies show up. What would you think? What would you make of that? Like, how would you rationalize that? How would you describe that? And the native people have all kinds of stories, like, Day of the Dead, obviously, they often, many people talk about it as it's their ancestors coming home to visit. I had people tell me that they call them palomitas, and they come like little doves, or they come, the cosechadores, they come and help harvest the corn because that's when the corn is going to be harvested. So there's just all this meaning and spirituality attached to the monarch butterfly. And I think that's a really other powerful dimension of it, that, it just sort of reinforces the entire cycle of life, that death is part of the cycle. We need to accept that. We need to celebrate that. And we need to look at it in a way that is positive and incorporating it into our lives. So we started that in 2020, and it continues. So here we are in the Texas funnel, and there's a lot of talk about monarchs are endangered. Monarchs are not endangered. And I don't know about you, but as somebody who follows this closely, I mean, I just get whipsawed. They're up, they're down. They're doing great, they're doing bad. And just in the last, I mean, we're lucky that we live here because we're always going to see monarch butterflies one way or the other. There will be more or less, but we're always going to see them. But there are significant threats to the monarch migration. You've got the illegal logging in Mexico. The forest there is a very specific environment that, they call it the Goldilocks climate, where it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's perfect for the butterflies, it's not freezing, they're not burning through their fats really quickly because, it's 45 or 50 degrees, sun comes out in the day, they can go fly to get some water and juice up. But there's just all kinds of crazy stuff happening in Mexico, and I have a chapter in my book about the cartels taking over part of the roosting sites area because it's the perfect place to cultivate avocados, which they call oro verde or green gold. It's a very, very profitable crop to grow, and they're literally seizing places and saying, hey, we're going to make an avocado farm out of this. It becomes a money laundering thing as well as a profit center. So you've got illegal logging in Mexico threatening the roosting areas. You've got the usual, habitat destruction in the United States and everywhere else with urban development. You got climate change, which this year has been insane. We've had the weirdest weather this year with it's super wet. Was it July that was just rain like crazy? Super hot in June. It wasn't that hot in August. I mean, it's crazy. And then up north, it was super hot. And so think about what it's like for these butterflies. They're expecting a certain climate and certain expectations, and everything is different. And then you have, the usual, pesticides, genetically modified crops, and all of that. There's a scientist in Mexico who's actually trying to move the forest. The forest where the monarchs roost is mostly populated by a particular kind of fir tree called the Oyamel fir, which is also called a sacred fir. And these trees have a very particular habitat requirement of, certain temperatures, certain altitudes. And as it gets hotter and drier, the trees are dying off. And he's literally moving Oyamel firs from, 9,000 elevation to 12,000 elevation, because he says within 50 years, the Oyamel fir forest won't exist anymore because it's too hot. They're not going to be there. And so here's a picture of his experiment. And he actually came to our festival, Cuauhtémoc Science Romero, and he teaches at the University of UNAM in Morelia. But there's a picture on top of a 3-year-old Oyamel fir that was planted in full sun. And then they realized, oh, wow, they need a little shade and a little help. So we're going to do a more mixed habitat to give some shade here. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. So I was saying about the whipsawing of the prognosis of the monarch butterfly. There's an organization called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and it's a worldwide Sweden-based organization of scientists and volunteers who every year evaluate species worldwide. And in 2022, in July of 2022, they listed the monarch butterfly as endangered. Now, it's a little inflammatory because when we hear endangered in the United States, we think of the Endangered Species Act and we think of all this enforcement and changes in the laws and all of that. But this is just like an organization that have no, regulatory capacity at all. They're just saying, hey, man, monarch butterflies are endangered. We need to take note. We need to do things to save them. That's caused such a stir. I don't know if you guys remember that. But then literally the following September, they revised it and said, you know what? They're not endangered. They're vulnerable. And so if you're following this, you're trying to figure out what to do and what to believe. It's kind of disconcerting that there's just such an array of different opinions about it. This is the actual, this is the Monarch Watch population status of the monarch butterfly, and it goes back to 1994. And you can see there in 1996-97, where there were 18.19 hectares of habitat at the roosting sites. They measure the forest where the monarchs roost. And it's very, very, I don't want to say unscientific, but it kind of is, because they basically walk around and they go, oh, yeah, there's 2 acres here. Yeah, 2 acres. And then they add it up. And then and this is all, this is all written in the book, the history of how they calculate it. It started out that they said there's 50,000 monarchs per, hectare or something. And then it was 20,000. And so it's just we could do something with drones, it seems like, but because the roosting sites are controlled by ejidos, which are community organizations in Mexico that are not necessarily governed by the Mexican government, there's a lot of rules about who can do what, and they don't want to do that. They want to keep doing it manually. But you can see here, just the last 3 years, in 2022, I can't read that, They were up 35%, and that's when the IUCN said, oh, I guess they're not endangered. And then they went down 22%. And then last year they were down 59% again. That is the second lowest roosting population since records have been kept. So just so you know, at the end of this year, by the end of this year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will be required to once again rule on if the monarch butterfly is endangered or not. In 2015, there was a petition submitted, and they took, I think, like 4 years to sort of get to it to decide. And they determined that the monarch butterfly indeed was endangered, but there were 160 something species in front of it that were even more endangered. So they were not going to apply the resources to it because there were other species that were more endangered than the monarch. But then they just said, okay, every 2 years, we're going to reevaluate this and take a look at it to make sure, we don't miss something. So this year is one of the years they're going to reevaluate it. And you're going to hear a lot about this by the end of the year. They're going to decide, are they endangered or not? And given this drop to 59% of what it was at the peak, it'll be interesting to see what happens. So my theory is not necessarily the popular one, but when I talk to scientists about migration, they all tell me that migration is ephemeral, that migration serves a moment in time, and that creatures migrate because they have to, because they don't have a choice. They need food, they need shelter, they need a hospitable climate. And frankly, migration is really hard. Migration is really often fatal. And in monarch butterfly world, migration is one of the top things that kills monarch butterflies. It's very, very challenging to migrate. Success is the reproduction of the species, and one of the main reasons that monarchs migrate is to reproduce. So if they're on the way up, when they come up, they're looking for the milkweed to lay the eggs on. When they're going down, they're going to look for mates to wait out the winter and have a mate in the spring and start that cycle all over again. But one of the things that we're seeing, and I write a lot about this in the book, is that we're having increasing migratory local populations of monarch butterflies. There's been a local population in Florida for decades. There's local populations in Houston. There's recent discoveries of monarch populations, I think, in South Carolina. And in California, there's tons of local monarch butterflies. And there's actually a scientist who swears by, don't get mad at me, Lee Marlowe, tropical milkweed, which is not native, but because people in their urban gardens are planting milkweeds and making it hospitable, the monarchs don't need to migrate up and down the coast anymore. We didn't even talk about the fact that there's a separate migratory population in California that goes up and down the West Coast. But we're seeing more and more of these local populations, and they do, they have other issues. They have, diseases, and they transfer, spores to each other that make them ill. But we are seeing more and more local populations, and that just seems to be a trend that, thanks to us, largely because of our warming world and other things, that will continue. So my theory is that and many scientists agree that monarch butterflies are not endangered, but the migration is definitely endangered. And I would not be surprised if in my lifetime monarchs don't migrate anymore. But I would like to point out that I don't know if you've noticed that we've been having a snout break. I don't know if you know about these snout butterflies, but there's snout butterflies everywhere. Just today, I bet I saw several hundred snout butterflies. And my theory is that monarchs will become more like snouts, that their population will swell and retract based on conditions. And when the seasonal variables are so hospitable, like we just had we had a dry spell, then we had some rain. So the hackberry, which is the monarch butterfly, which is the snout butterfly's host plant, they laid a ton of eggs. It was great. There's all this fresh, green, tender foliage for the caterpillars to nosh on. And wow, guess what? Within a couple of weeks, we had a snout break. We had tons and tons of snout butterflies. So, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the worst thing in the world if the monarch migration were to go away. And we had these local populations where it like bloomed when conditions were positive and sort of retracted and said laid low when they weren't. As Chip Taylor, the founder of Monarch Watch, said, monarchs will always be with us. And on that note, I wanted to read just a really quick 2-minute chapter to you before we take questions. This is the place right here where I got hooked, right there. I call it the monarch spot. And this is a description of that day when I did. It's called Magical Monarchs on the Llano. It's dry and windy and hotter than the average October day when I launch my kayak on the Llano River about an hour before sunset in search of monarch butterflies. Cicadas chitter as I push off from the put-in spot. A long spotted gar flushes in the shallow water. On this Saturday in 2005, a late season nectar buffet awaits the migrating insects, just the fuel they need to power their flight to Mexico. Our family ranch in the Texas Hill Country sits in the heart of the quote Texas funnel, the channel through which all migrating monarch butterflies east of the Rocky Mountains pass on their route to and from their winter roosts in Mexico. My friend Jenny Singleton had introduced me to tagging monarchs the previous fall. We tagged them at her place in nearby Hext, an exercise I found enchanting. Today, I was betting the butterflies would be present on our ranch on the Llano, given that we had a similar ecological setup, a river, flowers, pecan trees nestled against a protective limestone escarpment. I bought 100 tags from Monarch Watch and set out this afternoon searching. Would I find them? I paddled past stands of goldenrod toward the big riffle, our preferred waiting spot, as it thrums a comforting score. A few cardinal flowers flaunt their delicate red petals, and occasional purple asters peek from the tall grasses that grace the Chigger Islands. Monarch butterflies drift in a steady stream around and across the river, mostly from our side to the opposite. I scoot against the current along the karst-riddled bed toward 3 low-hanging pecan trees, their bare limbs stooped in submission to repeated floods. Small bushy cedars line the river bottom and release a piney scent. A belted kingfisher flies ahead, annoyed by my intrusion. He releases his rattling call. I step onto the bank and approach the pecan trees. Gnats hum in my ears as my red rubber boots stick a moment in the mud. I look up. A silent eruption of monarch butterflies wafts from the earth. Hundreds of them drift skyward, each of my steps disrupting their peace. Orange and black creatures lilt and glide with the rugged Llano uplift as their backdrop. Floating, flitting, fleeting, they alight on flowers and find their way to the trees. I grab my net and start swooping. Usually I nab just 1 or 2, but one swing nets 22 butterflies. I kneel down, lay my gear on the ground, and swaddle the net's white mesh upon itself to calm them. When I reach in to retrieve one, I remember plunging my hand into a minnow bucket on my father's fishing boat as a child. The captive's flutterings wriggle, the teeming epitome of life. One by one, I place a small round tag on each butterfly's discal cell, the pale gold center of gravity on the monarch's wing. The strategic placement of the tag allows the butterfly to continue the flight unencumbered, hopefully all the way to Mexico. I record the date, time, tag number, and insect sex. Then comes the best part, opening my clasp as the butterfly takes flight. No matter how many times I do it, a smile sprawls across my face. Buen viaje, mariposa monarca. Have a great trip. Within 15 minutes, I run out of tags. I kayak back to the house, return shortly with another sheet. Upstream, another pecan stand shades a thick frost-sweet patch. Monarchs perch like tiny birds on the white flowers, sipping nectar. By dusk, I tag 50 monarchs. The following Monday, I return to work, but I can't stop thinking about monarch butterflies. I'm compelled to research their biology and natural history. They haunt me in a good way. I felt their velvety softness. I marveled at their beauty and appreciated their resilience. I pressed the tag securely to their wing with a gentle but firm grasp, and then I released them to the wind for their final 800-mile flight home to a place they've never been. Thank you. So I'm happy to take some questions, if anybody has any. Yes, ma'am. Oh.
But we'll start in here, but if you could repeat the question in the microphone so all the folks on Zoom.
Sure. Yes, ma'am, back here.
I'm gonna ask 3 of them. How long does the monarch butterfly live? When they get to Mexico and you get $5 for a tag, does that mean that someone has killed the butterfly to get that tag?
No.
Okay, and then do they mate both ways, going south and north?
Okay, so the question was, how long does a butterfly live? It depends, because the ones in the springtime probably only live, several weeks, but the ones that migrate south in the fall and go to Mexico they can live months and months. And the thing is, reproduction is very expensive energy wise. So typically they can either reproduce or they can migrate. So if they migrate, they're not going to reproduce until the spring. But if they reproduce here, they're not going to migrate because they just don't have the energy to do that. The second question was the $5 tags. The $5 tags are, the $5 is given to people who find dead butterflies on the forest floor. So butterflies fly down there and then they die there. Either they reproduce and then they die, or something happens and they die, or they don't make it and they die right before they get there. So when you go down there, there's lots of dead butterflies on the forest floor, depending on where you are. And then the third question was,
Do they make children?
they do mate. Obviously, they mate in the springtime, like that first generation that comes up here. When those butterflies close and then they become, egg, caterpillar, chrysalis butterfly, then they start flying north and they then reproduce. And then that next generation reproduces in the fourth generation. But the ones that go south typically don't reproduce until they get down there. I mean, although we've seen here in Texas, it was interesting when I was first learning, I always heard, oh man, they don't migrate, they don't reproduce late in the fall. And I would see these courtship flights when they mate, they literally, the male locks on to the female. He goes and grabs the female with his pinchers and he like takes her around and flies around. It can last 24 hours. It's pretty impressive. And you'll see them, I've seen a couple recently, like, and it's really hot outside. And so I mean, mostly they're opportunists, like they're going to do what they need to do to be successful, which is to reproduce. So like, if they're running out of gas and they're, okay, look, I need to like make sure to perpetuate the life cycle here, they're going to mate. But if they can get down to Mexico and wait it out, just depending on the timing, they will do that. Yes, sir.
Are there, like, so for our specific area, are there milkweeds that we should plant or milkweeds that we shouldn't?
There are. That's quite a contentious topic. I have a chapter on that called the milkweed quandary. Milkweeds are very persnickety, and it's getting a little easier to get milkweeds. We have a couple of folks here from native plant nurseries who've been very, judicious in trying to provide locals with native milkweeds. Ideally, you want to plant native milkweeds. We have, 4 or 5 varieties here: antelope horn, swamp, zizotes. But the most available one, tropical milkweed, has a lot of issues with it. It's really easy to grow. It's really beautiful. It's very resilient, but it's also can become a super spreader event for diseases. So if you do that, you've got to be really, diligent about managing it and cutting it down to the ground in the fall so that it doesn't perpetuate bad health for monarch butterflies. But I'm pretty sure the Native Plant Society has a ton of resources on native milkweeds appropriate for whatever area you're in, what kind of soil you have. So it'd be worth looking into that. Way in the back.
Topic of tropic milkweed, do you know what is the mechanism that is really disrupting the butterfly migration? Is it because the flowering time is different or the chemistry is different?
The question was, how is tropical milkweed disrupting the migration? I think that's more about having milkweed available in the fall, because generally milkweed is not available in the fall. Like in Texas, we don't have a lot of milkweed because it blooms in the spring. At the ranch where we are, we have swamp milkweed in the fall. I mean, it's on the river and it's natural and it's native, and the butterflies lay eggs on it. Right now there's eggs on it at this moment, but because the climate's changing, all of that's kind of different. But I think it's more about just the availability of the milkweed, because the typical cycle is that the milkweed's in the spring, native and nectar plants in the fall. And that's kind of what you want to do. Although, again, a lot of that shifting with climate change in these local communities, continuing to mate throughout the year. So it's going to be interesting how that all shakes out. Yes, ma'am, right here.
Question for the Zoom people.
Yes, ma'am.
So a male or female?
It's an excellent question. The males have, the question was, how do you tell a male from a female? And I'm thinking I might actually have it. Okay, perfect. So this butterfly right here is a male. You see those 2 little dots on its wings? Those are the family jewels. And in previous times, apparently, those were pheromone sacs that emitted this crazy, chemical that drove the lady butterflies crazy. I've read different things about that, it doesn't do that anymore. I don't know why, but when you see the 2 dots on the male like that, that's the male. The females typically have little wider veins, the little panes of glass, like a stained glass window, but the males have those 2 dots on them.
Can we ask some of the Zoom? We've got a couple of Zoom questions.
Please.
Where do people in Texas find or visit a roosting site? The person that asked the question said they heard something about a town hall area.
The question was, where in Texas can you go visit a roosting site? I don't know of any place except private landowners along the Texas funnel where you could do that. I mean, there's particular places, like at our place, every year they come to the same spot, and I have my friend Jenny, like she knows a couple of people in the hill country, and they have places where they seem like they always roost there. And I think it has more to do with just the ecosystem set up, like, water, nectar, protection, a place to, roost at night. But I mean, I've also read, there's all kinds of email lists. There's a famous email list called the D-Plex, because the monarch is the Danaus plexippus, and like constant, updates of there's a roost in Minnesota tonight, there's a roost in Kansas City tonight, and there's like particular trees where monarchs will just drop down and like hang out in that tree for the night. So it can be very spontaneous, but it also seems like there's very particular places where they always go back to the same place. And it's kind of, I don't know, I feel really blessed, like that we have this place, and it makes me think that, do they leave, is there a pheromone trail? Like, is there some kind of chemical they're leaving behind? Like, how do they know this is a cool spot to go? But it probably has to do with the wind and like the drafting, and they end up there, and it gets dark, and so they drop down, and oh, great, there's a tree here, and there's some nectar, let's go do that. So.
One more question from Zoom. Do you have any recommendations of the best nectar plants?
Well, I'm a big fan of frostweed. Oh, what are the best nectar plants in Texas? I mean, it depends on where you live. It's very situational, as you know, your soil, your conditions, how much sun you get. But here on the Llano River and at my house, I've transplanted all these plants to my house, and I have frostweed all over the place. Like I think I brought 3 plants, and it's like all over. And goldenrod, the swamp milkweed's great, but there's so many. And I actually have a resource on my site where you can go to the Texas Butterfly Ranch, and there's a resource page, and you can also register your habitat for our habitat initiative. We have about 1,150 plus habitats registered at this moment, but there's a ton of resources up there. And again, it is very situational depending on your soil and how much sun you get and what latitude you're at. So great. Yes, sir, back there.
Next, there's probably image for blood plant production. Has there been any look to try to identify oil and milk, fir forest, bee forest, a satellite rather than?
I'm not. Because of, did you say because of oil production? I don't know the answer. The question was, is there a way to identify the forests of the OML trees in Mexico through satellite? I don't know the answer to that. I have never heard of that. It's possible, and it would seem like with drones now that it would be able to do it. But like I said before, the areas where the OML forest is controlled by ejidos, which are community organizations that have very particular rules and don't necessarily have to bow to government rules. So it's an interesting political situation as well as a conservation challenge. Way in the back.
You talked about the local population versus the migratory populations, and I went over the local population of Monarch. So you said that there's a correlation between the planting more trees and the local population popping up. Do you see that we want people to plant more trees, kind of like we want people to plant things, but are the local population detrimental to the migratory population?
The question was, are the local populations, which seem to be increasing, detrimental to the migratory population? That's an excellent question. It's a very contentious subject because what happens is, I think COVID taught us that when tons of people get together and there's disease, it's very easy to transfer the disease in a very crowded environment. And when you have for example, a limited milkweed, and all the butterflies are going to the same milkweed plant. And one of those butterflies has OE, which is a spore-driven disease that is very detrimental to the monarch's health. You know, spores drop down on the plant, and then the next butterfly comes along, and then they pick it up, and then they eat it, and then it just becomes this thing. And so it's very, you know, it's something to be considered that, you know, the having a local population on one hand can be a good thing, but if they're infected with diseases and then they mingle with the migratory population. But on the other hand, I was just reading an article recently about how they need to develop immunity to these diseases. So it's like you kind of have to weigh it all out. Like there's not a single answer to that question, but yes, it is definitely something that scientists are very concerned about. And they really encourage people to be thoughtful about managing the milkweed in a way that is the most healthy for the monarch population. Right here, ma'am.
Texas list of endangered and threatened species. I think it's under threatened. But when you try and get a wildlife exemption for planted milkweed, you can't get it. Is there any work being done to do that?
I'm not.
People who have more than 5 acres who aren't agricultural.
The question was, is there a way to get a wildlife exemption for planting milkweed in Texas?
Well, I know there isn't at the moment because I've been trying for 3 years, but is there any work by any of the organisations to push it? Because technically the wording of the wildlife exemption says endangered and threatened species, but they actually pick and choose which ones, and they're not picking the moment at the moment.
So in Texas, we have wildlife exemptions for property tax purposes. And the question was, is there a way to manage for monarch butterflies to get the wildlife exemption? But they're not endangered. I mean, they haven't been named that. So
They're on the
Yeah.
threatened.
okay, that's news to me. Yeah. But yes, I don't know the answer to your question. So that would be something for like an environmental attorney or something. I don't know the answer. Yeah.
I'll be-
Not that I'm aware of. Yes, ma'am, back there.
Do these butterflies fly at?
They've been, I'm not sure exactly how, but I mean, they've been seen from airplanes. I'm sorry, the question was sorry about that. The question was, how high do the monarchs fly? I mean, thousands of feet up they've been seen, and they roost at 10,000 feet. So I'm not sure how high planes fly, like, I have no idea, but I'm sure you guys know that, but yes, very high. And they are, and as I said before, it's not like they're flapping their wings for, 800 miles or 3,000 miles. I mean, they're drafting, they're resting, they're catching the winds. So, I mean, they're maximizing their energy as much as possible. Yes, sir.
I have monarchs come through and it looks like to me, from observation, once they hit, and I have a lot of good plants, they stay around for a week or two. They roost in my oak trees and my hackberry trees and stuff. They prefer the sun, the nectarian of the same plant, but they will go to the shade of the same plant. I'm talking about, really the best one I know of is Cromalina odorata, which is a Mexican plant that is to be grown here. It's being grown here. It's aggressive. I've got it all over my yard. I've also found other plants that I have that they like too for nectaring. One of them's from South Texas and stuff. So there's a bunch of plants that they nectar all the time. So there's a lot of great plants here that are, that are native here, are done well here, that you can use and put in your yard, and they'll stop over probably and stay a week or two. They usually stay until the wind in November, when the first strong wind in November comes. Those ones that have been staying in the yard move on.
Did you have a question?
The question was, I just wanted to explain, that there are plants out there. So somebody asked the question of what the plants are. Right. And I just named a couple of plants.
And there's lots of nectar plants available.
Right.
And appropriate for your situation. As I said, it's very situational. So just do a little research and you'll find the best nectar plants for your environment.
We don't have any more questions online. If anyone else has more questions in here.
Yes.
They could be tattered by the time they get there. I guess they are, right?
The question was, were they pretty tattered? It's shocking sometimes to see. I mean, even at the ranch, I mean, I won't even tag one that, I mean, his wings ripped off, some bird came along and took a big bite out of him, and yet he's still flying. And like people, one of the most common questions I get is, oh, doesn't it really hurt the butterflies when you put the tag? And it's like, man, these butterflies are tough. I mean, they're flying like 3 dozen miles. They're evading predators. A lot of them have bites out of their wing, and yet they continue their flight. So their resilience and strength is just inspiring, honestly. But yeah, you'll see some that are super faded. And you can tell the difference. That one that I showed you earlier, obviously, this is a very fresh butterfly right here, and the colors are bright, and their colors fade as they get older. But this guy's a freshie. He's just fresh out of the chrysalis, you can tell. So great. Well, I appreciate your time, everyone. I'll be right up if you want to buy a book. I'm happy to sign it. Thank you.